What is up, everybody, and welcome to another live developer Q&A talking about Battle for Azeroth here today. My name is Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore, and joining me is none other than Game Director Ion Hazzikostas.
Great to be back here again. We have a larger Sylvanas behind us this time.
We do, yes. Much larger Sylvanas. Cleverly blended with yourself, as usual. So yeah, we got lots of questions coming out today. A lot of stuff people have been talking about in the Battle for Azeroth Alpha recently.
Yep.
So that's primarily what we're going to be
Island
focusing
expeditions out there as of yesterday. It's been fun seeing people jump in, get ambushed by Sneaky Pete, and start to get a sense of the beginnings of what that feature is going to be all about.
Yep.
Obviously today is a Battle for Azeroth Q&A. I know there's, I've seen some questions, seen some rumblings, wondering what's up with our classic project. Obviously we announced it at BlizzCon. At the time, what Jay said on stage was it was the beginning of a journey. And shortly after that, we posted job openings, looking for people to come help us make it. Some astute observers may notice that a couple of the listings that were on our careers website not too long ago are no longer on our careers website. So work continues. We would love to share more, and we'll do so when we're able. But for now, let's talk BFA.
Awesome. Yeah, let's get right into it. First question for today is a big one that I know lots of people have been looking for an answer to. Question is, will we get playable Zandalari Prelates, which are paladins?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some astute observers as well have noticed that in Zandalar in the beta, there's this sect of Zandalari Prelates that channel powers of the light. They draw upon the Loa Razan to do so. Now, slight spoilers, but something may happen to disrupt their ability to channel those powers. But it's a fair point that, once they've come close to harnessing, wielding those powers, maybe they could learn to do so again in a more structured way. We will have to see down the line when Zandalari do become fully available as a playable allied race. That's not going to be right at the start of BFA. That's something a bit further down the road, as that's part of what sort of the first chapter, the first main arc of the expansion is leading towards. We are going off to the new world to seek the aid of the Zandalari trolls and the Kultiran humans on our respective factional sides, but getting them to formally join our faction, that's kind of more of an endpoint than a starting point here.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, obviously, a big core part of the allied races feature is the actual going out and getting them to join your faction.
Yeah, it literally is the story of the expansion.
Yeah.
For now.
Okay. Next question comes from Rancor, another Zandalari question, asking, are the Zandalari's height final, or will they be made taller, at least Tauren height?
I'm not sure how they match up to Tauren specifically. Players in the most recent alpha build may have noticed Zandalari, we did actually make them larger, I think about 10 to 15% larger. It's important that if you compare them to a Darkspear troll, the Darkspear are naturally hunched, the Zandalari have a more upright posture, but when the Darkspear, they have a few animations, part of their idle and stand variations, where they will just kind of stretch their backs. When they do that, they should be seeing more like eye to eye with the Zandalari, whereas before they were kind of dwarfing them, which felt completely wrong. And actually player feedback was important in calling our attention to that issue, and we were happy to fix it.
Awesome. Cool. Moving on. Next question comes from Blood Guzzler, who asked, do allied races always come in pairs when introduced, or could we see a situation where a faction has more options than the other?
I think for now, as we are sort of in the early stages of rolling out allied races and players are seeing the first ones, I think it's very likely we would always do them in pairs. In the long run, I think we're open to one-offs where it makes sense. I think in the long run, we would still always try to aim towards a faction balance between the two sides. But depending on where the story's going, right now it makes a ton of sense for this race to join the Alliance, and then maybe a patch later that other race will join the Horde. We would be open to that.
Okay. Cool. Moving right along. Next question comes from Cyclone, who asked, can we get confirmation for the allied races planned for BFA? Pretty sure we all want to know, so we'll know what we'll want to level up, plan our character deletions accordingly at all. So, real quick, could you just tell us every single allied race that's ever planned to be added to the game?
Not currently. Sorry. I think we've mentioned a few. You've seen Dark Iron, mentioned Mag'har, Draenor orcs. Just to be clear, Mag'har means uncorrupted in Orcish. It's not the literal the Mag'har faction from
the Pox
survivors from traditional Outland. It's just brown orcs think of them that way, of
Sure.
various tribes. And then obviously, Kultiran and Zandalari that we just talked about. Beyond that, I think what we've always said is this is a foundation upon which we'd love to build in the future. One clarification, though, I think character deletions, at least on a server level, aren't something I would worry about when it comes to allied races. We gave everybody 4 new character slots when the 4 allied races became available with pre-sales shortly after 7.3.5. As we add new allied races, we would continue increasing the number of character slots. We don't want to make you delete one of your existing main characters on your server if you want to make a new allied race that you've unlocked.
Congratulations on your new allied race. Now delete an alt or something like that. Not quite a great experience. Makes sense. Let's see. Next question from Fearish, who asked, will the current allied races receive more customization options? They seem to be lacking a lot compared to the base races. And I know that from my end, just looking around community feedback and stuff, I've seen a few bits of feedback, which we have been forwarding on to the art team about like some of the Nightborn customization options and stuff.
I think those were heard. I think beyond that, I think specificity is super helpful here. I think, there's, depending on the different races, there are different aspects of them that you can customize, whether it's, tattoos or other markings for some, but not others. There's certainly, complete intent to have them be equal in all regards. So if there's a specific race or race-gender combination that you feel is lacking, definitely let us know.
Okay, sounds good. Next question from Kylandris, who asked, any plans on adding new customization options to our current non-allied races, such as new hairstyles, beard styles, earrings, new options? Last time we had an exciting update was back in 4.2. So obviously there was that whole new character models thing that happened with 6.0, but anything else in terms of customization options for non-allied races?
Not currently planned on the near horizon, something we would definitely like to do. I think we completely understand, the ability to better personalize your character, and the more variety we can offer there, the better. It's just a matter of what we do first, what comes next. Right now, a lot of the character art team's focus is on making the new allied race models and their appearances just for the upcoming BFA expansion.
Okay. And I believe this next question, yes, we have a very similar question coming from someone named Grizzly Sorcery, which like a bearmancer or something. Maybe a hidden class idea for the future in there. I'm just being cheeky.
Right after Dinomancers.
Dinomancer, yeah. Just take an object, put the word Mancer on the end of it, and it just basically writes itself. Anyway, question is, Chris Robinson stated at BlizzCon that the character creation will be receiving an update. Any word on that? I think this came out of the Q&A panel, if I'm remembering.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was a good question. Really, it was more of a valid complaint, kind of noting some, just some of the deficiencies. Again, coming back to the last question, people obviously would like the ability to customize their characters more. It's something we want to do. It's not one of the core features for Battle for Azeroth, but it's something that we definitely want to do as soon as we're able in terms of other projects.
Yeah, and I think there's a good sort of notion to get across there as well, which is that obviously much like you guys, like we also play the game and we see things in the game that we're like, man, wouldn't it be great if this was improved or if that was improved, and so on and so forth. And just because we recognize that something needs to be improved doesn't necessarily mean it's in the immediate time frame, but it's still something that we're like, yes, this could be better, and we'd like to work on.
And that's, I think there's, as the quality of new content advances, and this is something that people have asked about the non-allied races, some old racial models where they would like more customized druid forms as well, for example. As we raise the bar, obviously everything that was there before feels a little bit rougher by comparison, and so there's a natural desire to want to modernize it, to want to refurbish it, and it's something that we're always looking to do, but we can't do in real time. Like, if it was a requirement to push the bar forward at all, that we bring everything else up to that new line, we would either move it a millimeter or just not at all.
Right.
And so I think it comes in cycles, it comes in waves, and I think we're always looking back to see what we can, make cooler, whether it's, going back and looking at player summoned pets that happened pretty broadly in Legion and making those higher fidelity, or spell class visuals, or elements of our UI, and so forth. I think, like Josh was suggesting, we have a very long, very, very long laundry list of many of the same gripes and things that we want to improve. about all aspects of the game. And it's just a question of, all right, well, there's only so many hours in the day, in the week, in the month. Which one are we going to do first? Which one are we going to do next? And I wish we could do them all at the same time, but those are just the realities of production.
Yep, unfortunate, but that's how it works, sadly. Can't just imagine things into existence. I mean, maybe one day, quantum computing or something. Anyway, next question comes from Karoni, who asked, is there any chance to give old races heritage armors like the allied races?
Yeah, that's actually sort of in the same vein as what I was just saying. That's something, no immediate plan right now, but that's an awesome idea, and it's something I think we'd like to do. Long-term, philosophically, allied races aren't meant to be better or cooler than mainline races. It's just different. It's just a different form of expression and an outgrowth of the story that we're telling. Heritage armor, and I think there's something very cool about the idea of imagining, like, what is the canonical Night Elf armor set? What does that look like? What is the Tauren armor set, etc.? We have to think about how to earn those. I think just leveling to max doesn't really feel like it makes sense, especially with characters that people have already had for a long time. You just log in and get it for free. I could imagine, this is sort of off the top of my head, I could imagine us doing racial quest lines. That could be interesting, and in that world, they probably wouldn't come out all at the same time, but it might be, all right, in this .5 patch, these two races have their racial quest line that they can complete to earn their heritage armor and roll those out over time. But in the long run, I think it would be awesome for every race to have that expression of their identity available.
Cool. Yeah, and just for clarity, we're talking about like a theoretical future thing. This isn't like on the planned features list for 8.0 or anything like that.
Correct.
Okay. Just wanted to get that one out there before I start getting where
was,
are the heritage
that
armors?
That was like, I know, things I probably shouldn't do in Q&As for 100, Alex. That was genuine. That was legitimate, just off the top of my head. That might be cool if. Let's think about it.
Yeah.
Not an announcement of anything. Sorry.
It's all good. I'll forgive you eventually. Next question comes from Azria, who asked, how could players improve in our ability to communicate our wishes and suggestions to the dev team? Is there a particular platform that better facilitates these discussions, such as Twitter, the forums, etc.?
Snapchat mainly. No, yeah, I'm not. Sorry, Josh. No. So this is actually a good question. I don't mean to make light of it. Honestly, sincere feedback. Data is always helpful, depending on what it is that you're trying to get across. If it's the look of something, then screenshots are helpful to illustrate the point. If it's something about balance, then logs or other data that you have. Rational feedback is always better than charged emotional feedback, though at the end of the day, I understand that things come from a place of passion. If you're angry about something, if you feel betrayed, that's going to come through. We try to see through that to get to the underlying point. Specificity is always really helpful. I think a lot of the time on Twitter and elsewhere, there'll just be the tweet of like, when are you going to fix Ret Paladins? And it's like, well, actually, I'd probably love to if it was clear what exactly that was referring to. There are there are a number of bugs, loopholes, quirks, inconveniences, and there isn't always visibility into every little nuance of all of them. And so if there's a bug, being specific, like, this is broken, can you please fix it? Super helpful. And beyond that, in terms of framing feedback, I think it's probably helpful to try to make feedback personal more than looking to speak for a broad group. I think it's a trend that I see very commonly on Twitter, on forums, elsewhere. It's increasingly rare to see, I don't like this, in a sentence. It's, we don't, we want, no one likes this.
Yeah.
And I understand it's easy, if there's a thread in the forums and there's 8 people that are all outraged about something, it leads to this sense of, well, everyone is in agreement. We all think that this should change. No one likes this system. Everyone would prefer it that way. But from our perspective, we're seeing, conflicting feedback often from multiple sides. And it helps a bit to cut through that and tie it to your own personal experience. It makes the feedback more sincere and relatable when it's not making an absolute claim that we know to largely be not absolute, right? If there ever is something that actually no one likes and we're hearing nothing but negative feedback about it, we're almost certainly hearing the same thing internally, we change those things. We roll those things back pretty quickly or make improvements where we can.
Yeah, definitely. And like adding on to that a little bit, a big part of what community does for World of Warcraft, we have like hundreds of people worldwide whose job is to literally go through the forum posts and track and gather data on, okay, how many people are upset about this in terms of the overall like population and the overall like number of people who are talking about this class, how many of them are saying that this is the biggest issue, how many of them are saying this is the biggest issue, and so on. So when you say things like everyone thinks that X is bad or everyone thinks that Y needs a buff, we already have data on what everyone thinks in those cases. So it's more about expressing what your particular viewpoint is and what your addition to that conversation is, and less about trying to convince us that, like, just basically don't worry about trying to convince us that everybody hates something. If everyone hates something, we already know that everyone hates it, is basically what I'm getting to with that.
Much. And yeah, it's actionable specific feedback is what I'm getting to, what I'm getting at without belaboring the point too much. I think it's
exactly.
Shadow Priests are awful to play, not super helpful. I don't feel very useful in dungeons because my AoE has such a high ramp time and I can't get into the Mythic Plus groups at high keys. That's really frustrating. That's actionable feedback, right?
Yep.
That's the exact kind of thing that leads us to make changes.
Yep. And as to the second part of the question, just to harken back to it real quick, asking about, is there a particular platform that better facilitates these discussions? It depends on exactly what sort of discussion you're trying to have. Obviously, if you're trying to put together a big long list of here's everything that I would like to see improved, the forums are going to work better than Twitter. Don't try and string together like 15 tweets because that just makes it completely unreadable. Go to the forums with stuff like that. Little things like, hey, I found a visual bug, it's in this spot. That's perfectly fine for Twitter because it's an easy way to embed an image and so on. I would say just think about what the feedback is that you're trying to express and whether it makes sense for that platform, not necessarily trying to stick to the one platform that's going to get extra views because there isn't one really. Moving on, next question comes from Mythic. We had a bunch of people asking about this one in particular, who said, when and how much will classes be unpruned in BFA to see utility return to classes? I know that was something we were talking about a bit at BlizzCon, and sort of like the notion of maybe we went a little bit too far with the pruning.
And I think it's... And yes, obviously there have been a couple of abilities that have come back. I know there was much rejoicing around Hammer of Wrath, things like that, or more old school buffs like Prayer Fortitude or Arcane Intellect. But at the same time, I don't know that we view it as explicitly unpruning so much as adding. And in some cases, there was already a good tool to solve a certain problem that we can take from the historical record and bring back. In other cases, we're coming up with new things where it makes sense. One of the focuses of the class team as they laid out in the blog that was released just before the start of Alpha when it comes to class design and Battle for Azeroth is class differentiation, class identity, in the sense of, and utility is a big part of that. It's not just class fantasy, but why are you happy in a dungeon group to see a priest, to see a rogue, or to see whatever in your group? What's the thing that they bring? What's the thing that makes them feel special, that makes them feel cool, and vice versa? And some of those are already present, and we can just double down on them. In other places, we can, add new things. And yes, in some cases, that will mean more pruning, if you want to call it that, where too many people have something, like in the area of AoE stuns was a prominent example that came up in that blog.
Right.
Where actually, when 7 people bring it, it just kind of distorts the entire metagame of doing that group content because you can chain stun so easily, but it also stops feeling special at all. And when we slather the same tools around across many different classes, it leads to a sense of sameness that isn't ideal, I think. We're, as also noted in that blog, I think we are looking to double down on strengths rather than shore up weaknesses, because that's how you end up with 12 classes that truly feel unique and distinct rather than just different flavors of the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. We saw a lot of, and every time we have a Q&A, we'll get a lot of questions in that are something along the lines of, my class is the only one without a fill-in-the-blank here. When are we getting the fill-in-the-blank here? And a lot of times it's like, great, we found a thing that you don't have. That means that we can make the rest of your class better to make up for that.
Exactly. And I think envy, I think, is actively healthy. I think it's great to look at other classes and see things that you wish you had, as long as they're also looking back at you and thinking the same thing. Whenever it's lopsided, that's when it's a problem. And that's fair, right? If there is a class or a spec that rightly feels that they're not bringing much, that they are the last choice in the eyes of a raid leader or someone putting together an RBG group or someone looking for a final spot for a Mythic dungeon, then that is feedback we'd like to hear, preferably with specificity, and that's a problem we would actively like to solve.
Okay. Sounds good. Moving on to the next question here from Spooby, who asked, since Mists of Pandaria, I feel I've been losing baseline abilities. This makes me feel less excited for new expansions because I know I'm getting less. Why is this the design direction? So, design director Ion Hazzikostas.
So Mist was around the turning point of when we realized that continuing to add several new abilities with every expansion just wasn't tenable or sustainable. Actually, back then, 8 years ago, I was personally working in class design and helping out with that directly. And I can attest to the fact that, like, going into Cataclysm, going into Mists, there were a few places where there were clear problems and clear gaps that we could solve with new abilities, and that was great. But far more often, it was sitting down and looking at Death Knight, looking at Rogue, looking at whoever, and saying, okay, got to come up with 3 things for them. What do they need? And looking at the class, and there really wasn't a whole lot that they desperately needed because they'd already been through 2 expansions, like Burning Crusade and 5 new abilities there, shored up most of the gaps and got most of the classes to a rounded state. And so what that led to was, in the name of leveling, for the sake of having something to earn, very often adding abilities that were kind of redundant, that were, okay, yet another offensive or defensive cooldown, or shoring up weaknesses in a way that was like easy to make and satisfying. It's like, okay, let's give the low mobility class a movement ability. Cool. That's obviously going to be well received. At the same time, it leads to that feeling of sameness where everyone has a sprint in the long run. And so beyond Mists, we've been pulling back from that a bit, I think, and that was removing some of those abilities that were deemed truly extraneous and not just by default adding tons of new ones. We know there's some downside in terms of how exciting that makes leveling feel in the moment-to-moment experience when you're 90% of the way towards a new level. What does that actually mean to you? That's something we're currently exploring some ideas to improve. But in the place of baseline abilities, we've been looking to do a lot more with gameplay modification through external sources. Controversy about how they were distributed notwithstanding, that's a lot of what legendaries were trying to accomplish in Legion. Some of those legendaries were on par with things that might in the past have been standalone abilities or passives that meaningfully transformed your rotation. Certainly the artifact actives fell into that same space, and in Battle for Azeroth, Azerite armor modifications are going to do a lot of that heavy lifting. And that said, where it makes sense, where there is something that a class needs, we're totally open to continuing to add new abilities, but we don't want to be going down a road where we're just adding more and more and more mechanically without purpose.
Okay. Sounds good. I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Next question comes from Natural NA? I'm not sure. PvE class balance. Are we going from balancing classes and specs based on rating to balancing classes and specs based on Mythic Plus content? So the sort of overall idea of is the focus with class design now nowadays more on rating versus Mythic Plus, or somewhere in the middle?
Somewhere in the middle, I would say. I think it's definitely a consideration, and I think it's healthy. I think increasingly, the more both of those types of environments can stress a wide variety of skill sets and strengths and weaknesses, the more diverse and the better truly balanced the game can be. If we're just trying to balance for the theoretical patchwork DPS of like what is your sustained 5-minute damage against a target dummy, then yeah, no matter how well balanced it is, someone's going to be in the high end, someone's going to be in the low end. But ideally, raids and dungeons are both testing all of those damage profiles, and when things like the tyrannical modifier in Mythic Plus dungeons can stress that important single target damage, while fortified or some dungeons that have lots of trash packs to clear, it's more about sustained AoE or split cleave, etc., etc., etc. And so ideally, there are strengths and weaknesses across all of these profiles, and we would still take action if there was somebody that was completely dominant or really, really far on the low end in either of these 2 spheres.
Okay. Sounds good to me. Okay. I almost dropped my little thing for a second. Thought I might have accidentally mashed a button that I shouldn't have.
Crisis averted.
I think we're good. That's why I have buttons that don't do anything. Next question from Liara, who asked, can we expect higher value of primary stats compared to secondary stats? I know that was a major goal with a lot of the itemization that was done in Legion and even in late Warlords. How are we looking going into Battle for Azeroth?
Yes, I think it's something we need to do better in BFA. I think I would say it wasn't necessarily a main goal in Legion, which was the problem.
Okay.
In Legion, there was a lot of effort in Legion itemization went into giving you more of your secondary stats up front and having them scale a bit more slowly over the course of the expansion, trying to solve some very valid problems that had reared their head in past expansions where, looking at haste or crit, for example, for specs that were very dependent on those stats, at the start of an expansion, things felt very sluggish. You just had a kind of uncomfortably low level of, let's say, haste. But then by the end, when you were 150 eye levels higher, you had so much of those stats that,
Right.
it was similarly degenerate. We tried to start you with more and have you get less along the way, but that had the very unfortunate side effect of shifting more and more of the value of items into secondary stats up front in a way that made item level less important. Anyway, long story short, we want item level more often than it was in Legion to enable easy and clear-cut decisions on upgrades. Obviously, if you're looking just 5-10 eye levels apart, or it's your two best stats compared to your two worst stats, that'll be something to think about. But we don't want to see the cases that we often saw in Legion. We were looking at an item 20, 25 eye levels up and wondering whether it's an upgrade and then simming it and finding out that it's actually not.
Yeah, that's always it's just a bad feeling. You get an item and it's a new item from a new raid, and you look at it and you go, ugh, this actually isn't better than my non-warforged old piece of gear. So.
And even if it is, having that doubt and feeling like, okay, I have to go sim this or go look it up, that itself is just uncomfortable overhead that makes the moment of getting loot less exciting, even if it ends up actually being an upgrade.
Yeah, and you shouldn't have to sim gear to find out if it's an upgrade or not. You should be able to look at it and go, yes, this has more things. I would like this with additional things. Cool. Next question comes from Rattlesnake87, who asked, don't you think it feels kind of bad to have to use a talent choice now for stuff that used to be baseline, especially for artifact skills? Wouldn't it be better to make them baseline for the specs that depend on that skill and just remove it if not? So obviously there's a lot of artifact abilities that are now becoming talents that I think a lot of people felt were like, no, I need this. This has to be part of my rotation.
So, yes, it feels bad. In the short term, there's no question that taking something that, you're a fire mage, you're used to having an ability, you've had it for the last year and a half, now you have to choose between that and two other things. It's hard. I agree. It is hard to get excited about that. That is a short-term sacrifice that we're making for sort of long-term design elegance. I think a year or two from now, no one will remember that the classes played this way in Artifact. I mean, some people will remember.
Some people will definitely remember.
They will definitely remember. But by and large, the moment-to-moment player experience is not going to be, oh, this talent in this row 2 years ago used to be in my Artifact. It's just, this is what the class is. These are the talent choices I'm making.
Right, yeah.
This is how it interacts with Azerite armor, and so forth. And kind of as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of hesitation to add new interactions, new procs, new rotational abilities into a class baseline because it's not necessarily clear that the class needs those things. Obviously, if in the talent rows it turns out that actually 98% of players are taking this and it really does feel like universally across all play styles this makes the class better, more fun to play, those are the things that we do make baseline. There's a long history there of doing that with talents, but we prefer, in this case, to start with the talent, see how that plays out, and then roll into the class if it truly does prove to be required.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out, especially at this stage of the Battle for Azeroth Alpha, that what you're seeing in the Alpha is almost 100% experimental. Obviously, you can get sort of a notion of where the class team is going with certain things, but the reason that we call it Alpha is because it's very early in development still. So
yes.
Okay. Cool. Moving on. Next question comes from J Funk Gaming, who said, recently in the alpha builds, you have given some classes Legion legendary effects as talents. How will those talents interact when combined with those same Legion legendaries?
Yeah, so this is another example of, effects that were fun that we want to find ways to carry forward. Current thinking is that they will just stack, whether that means that you have 2 independent chances to proc some effect, or your hardcast Pyroblast deals way more damage. some form of that, so that if you have both, at least as you're leveling, it'll be cool.
You end up with a pre-squish Pyroblast with your 800% damage increase on it. I actually really want to try that now. Okay, moving on. Next question comes from Jürgen Hahn, who says, we know that artifacts are going away. Can you tell us what types of weapons they'll be replaced with? So I think he's talking about, we've sort of talked a little bit about the concept of sometime towards the end of Legion, there's going to be some sort of thing that occurs that makes it so that you no longer have your powered up artifact. What's going on there?
So yeah, there's still a little bit more story to unfold that will kind of take players through this. But once the Battle for Azeroth, once the 8.0 patch is live, and we're sort of in that Battle for Azeroth pre-expansion phase, the artifact isn't going away entirely. You will still wield your Ashbringer or whatever your artifact is. You'll still have your relics in it. It'll still be what it was, but the traits on it will be disabled. That will be burned out. You'll still continue to use the weapon for some time until you replace it with something cool, and then going forward,
Green quest rewards.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Green, yes. A really awesome stick with a nail in it. And it's like, yeah, okay, but it's higher level than my Ashbringer.
Severed arm.
So, but yes. And then going forward in Battle for Azeroth, it's just weapon drops, as was the case throughout World of Warcraft's history prior to Legion. So, plus, you'll see Warglaives now, because that's a new type.
Nice. Are they... Never mind. I'm just going to move on. Next question comes from Bo Buchan, who says, why do some classes have talent rows that purely focus on AoE or single target on BFA Alpha? And I think this is an interesting question that comes up because it's kind of what, especially back during like Mists of Pandaria, that's kind of when we first rolled out this new talent system that we've been using since. Yeah. And that was kind of what the philosophy was back then, is the talents, it should be comparable between the 3 of them. They should be relatively similar. We got away from that. Now we're kind of going back towards it. What's going on there?
It varies. So I think there's something cool about being able to pick a number of, let's say, utility options, or focus on movement or focus on defense. But a lot of what we found through Legion was that multiple separate row choices that were AoE or single target customization didn't really lead to satisfying gameplay, because it was just very binary. It was situational. It was, okay, I'm fighting Varamathras right now. I need to be spec'd for single target. If I'm spec'd for AoE, I'm significantly worse. Or, oh, I'm doing a heavy ads fight right now. I need to be spec'd for AoE. And the choice was either those talents don't meaningfully affect your gameplay very much. They're only a couple % power, in which case they don't feel particularly good. You don't feel like you're actually spec'd for AoE. Or you feel massively disadvantaged compared to some other classes or specs that don't have those talent choices but just have a certain baseline capability. And, that doesn't feel good either. Or when you spec for AoE, you're just the best at AoE in the game. So it was just the kind of thing that wasn't leading to very interesting gameplay. It was more just, all right, time to burn a tome on this as I switch back and forth in a way that feels mandatory but uninteresting.
Yeah, and I know looking at PvP as well, we've had some issues in the past where it was like, in each row there was like, here's the single target, the AoE, and the stun. Next row, here's the single target, the AoE, and the stun. And then you end up in PvP. I can just take 6 stuns and just DR 2 people on stuns with just one class. So obviously getting away from that and making you choose between similar talents more regularly can help with that as well.
Yep.
I did not intend for this to happen, but that's actually kind of ties in directly with the next question, which came from Northern Fury, who asked, are there any real plans to address the CC in PvP besides their duration? Almost feels like right now CC is back to its old ways where you can be locked out for 40+ seconds.
Yeah, I think that this is something that's just an ongoing area of change and work. It's a fine line with CC, because if CC is too limited, then the game just turns into DPS races in PvP. And it's just a question of who can kill the other first as you're trying to do your respective rotations on each other. And there isn't a whole lot of depth to that. At the same time, obviously, feeling like you should just take your hands off your keyboard because you don't get to play for long stretches of time, also super frustrating. Generally, these long CC chains tend to involve multiple players. And so unless you're in World PvP or some other imbalanced like 3v1 setting where, yes, you're probably going to lose. Sorry. You should have teammates that generally we tend to think of as the right counter to this. Like, yes, if you let 3 people cycle their CCs on you without disruption, they can lock you down completely. But that's where your teammates, well, then they're not being controlled at all, presumably, so they're free to, try to go for a kill or to disrupt and peel so that you can get free. Now, I think where it starts to be problematic is where it's seeming like it's only taking a couple of players to do this, or where it's a lot of instant casts involved, and there isn't a lot of counterplay to it. And as always, I think specific examples are what's super helpful there. If your experience is like, all right, I was going against a mage and a rogue, and I don't know what I could have done because I was just locked out and had no control for, 13 consecutive seconds, those are useful examples to give, and those are the things we want to look at.
Cool. Yeah, makes a lot of sense to me. It's also, it's worth noting, it does actually take a fair amount of skill as well to be able to just line up those CCs. So you look at something like Rogue Mage, which is often looked at as like, this is the CC comp, and they're just going to chain CC my healer for ages. Although, at the top levels of play, it becomes so natural for these players that they just sort of just up and do it. Like, yeah, I'm going to polymorph, and then he's going to cheap shot, and then kidney shot, and so on from there. That does actually take a lot of skill to be able to do. And it's not something that a lower tier player can really just pull off quite as naturally. So there is an element of wanting to retain that sort of the ability to play well in that sort of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, crowd control is a huge part of the skill ceiling in WoW's PvP.
Yep. Next question comes from Turtoth, who says, any more details on Prestige, namely the rewards? Is anything going away, or can I still get it in Battle for Azeroth?
Yeah, current plan, so I think we're still working through the details, but we want those rewards to still be available. We want those rewards to be earnable through just participation in PvP. We don't want to move them to some other system. I think anyone who's put in the time to earn them in battle, we don't want to undermine, or in Legion, we don't want to undermine that time investment by, throwing them on a vendor or something. And at the same time, we also don't want to, necessarily just keep adding dozens and dozens of new ones, such that a new person getting into the PvP system a few years down the line looks at this and feels like they never have any hope of getting them all. But I think the concept of cosmetic awards for just participation in PvP is something we want to retain and build upon. So things like titles, mounts, enhanced unit frames, all of that stuff.
Cool, yeah, and currently not planning on removing any of the prestige rewards that
Correct.
Or making them unavailable.
Correct. They will all be there. They'll all be attainable.
Cool. So no need to panic too much about getting all that done before the end of Legion. But now is actually a really good time to be working on that. Next question comes from Reluctor, who says, excuse me, is there a chance in BFA that even RP or RP PvP realms can have world defense back, since we're not sharded or cross-realm?
Right. Shout out to Emerald Dream here. Yeah, I think it's something, as we move into the new war mode system with, a separate PvP rule set that everyone can opt into and share in, we'd like to find a way to bring back the concept of a channel like this. Ideally, it would be a broader solution than something that just applies to a small handful of servers. But obviously, there's something very cool about, hey, enemy faction spotted here, someone important calling for help, the way you used to see back in the day, and we'd like to find a way to make it happen.
Okay. Sounds good to me. So maybe not specifically world defense, but something that fills that same sort of role as an idea that's on the table. A question from Not Like Vix, who says, with recent pushes toward personal loot, is there a reasonable expectation that it will be the only option for current level raids going forward into Battle for Azeroth?
That is a reasonable expectation. I think we've seen increasing adoption of personal loot with the improvements in Legion, notably the ability to trade items around and the fact that it gives a higher total loot count compared to group or master. I think the big thing that's kept people using master loot generally has been set pieces and the desire to, funnel set pieces to specific people to let them complete their sets, which is harder to do with personal, but we don't have set pieces in the same way in Battle for Azeroth. So personal loot as a universal system increasingly makes sense. This isn't our primary motivation for doing it, but it also has a nice side effect of somewhat balancing out the very high end of the raid scene in terms of split runs and loot funneling. And yes, there's still some advantage to technically having multiple alts, but in kind of mathy technical terms, it's what's currently happening with split runs is the equivalent to, rolling 6 dice and adding them up, and that's what you get.
Right.
Whereas in a person loot world, well, you can still roll 6 dice and take the highest of the 6 and go with that. The difference between that and someone who's just doing it normally is going to be way, way, way smaller, which in turn enables better raid balance, a more even playing field for everybody when there isn't the same level of possibility of people coming in, 10, 15 item levels ahead of the average curve that first week and yet still expecting to be challenged.
Yeah, I think I know there's been lots of discussion about alts and split runs and how it can be detrimental to the high-end raiding experience, but I think the full impact of what it is something that probably only really the top-end raiders really fully understand. We're talking about a situation in which, because you can say this is the Death Knight that all of the Death Knight loot is going to in this entire raid, because you have so many different alts that you can bring in and rotate them in and out, and you thus have the ability to funnel all of the loot to that one Death Knight in this situation. That now means that your Death Knight going into the next raid is so far geared in advance of what everyone else has, which means that the raid needs to be significantly more difficult in order for it to still be a challenge for the top-end raiders, which then means that it's going to be even more difficult for the people who are behind the curve. It causes all sorts of knock-on issues.
Yeah, this is a very small niche problem.
Absolutely.
But the use of master loot is actually, these days limited to organized raiding guilds that are assigning their loot. So it's actually more important within that group than it might otherwise seem within the game as a whole when it comes to us making this decision.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense, but obviously something that we're looking for all sorts of feedback on and thoughts as well. Question here from Perculia, who asked, there's a mission table in Zuldazar on the Alpha, as well as data mined followers. What is the general role of the mission system in Battle for Azeroth, and are there any notable differences from Legion?
I think I would say yes, there will be a mission system. It's similar to what we had in Legion systemically. I would say probably even a little bit smaller in scope, take another step back away from what garrisons were in Warlords. Here, rather than tied to your class order hall, they're more tied to the war campaign. Think about building your SEAL Team 6 or your A Team, your elite squad of specialists that are going to conduct war operations in the enemy continent and provide reconnaissance, open up quests, open up content for you. Not too different from Legion. We're probably going to back away a little bit from using them as a time-gating vehicle because that never felt particularly exciting to do your 12-hour missions or whatever. But it's an outlet for war resources, the analog to order resources that you'll be getting from world quests, things along those lines. There are some tweaks to the mechanics of the system, but nothing gigantic. I think we're happy with where the system ended up in Legion. And I know coming into Legion, when we announced that we were doing this, there was a lot of concern from people who felt burned by Warlords in a world where the mission system there felt like it overshadowed other content. Whereas I don't think that's been the same sense when it comes to Legion. Obviously, there's some awkwardness to it. There are some things we can tune better about it. But it's a complement to the core gameplay, which is, 99% of the game is still just that traditional go out and punch things or cast fireballs at things and get loot. That's not changing.
Yeah, I think most of the feedback that we've been seeing and tracking has been revolving around, like you say, the whole do 5 missions that are 12 hours in order to get to the next stage of your order hall campaign, and having character content that you would do yourself on your character gated behind this stuff. So if we're moving away from that and just sort of looking at it specifically as this is an alternate system that you can use to get maybe some little side rewards, but it's not something you have to do to unlock content.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's viewed as it's a flavorful sort of thematic way. If you do some world quests, You get some extra resources from doing that, and then you can choose among a set of bonuses to further augment your rewards that you got in the course of getting those resources. And you're doing it in a way that is tied into the story of the war and gives you something to look forward to when you get home. You see what's in the box that came back from your mission, all of that kind of stuff.
Cool. Sounds good. Next question from VStrong1374, who said, Mythic Plus has been by far my favorite addition to the game since its inception. What, if anything, can you tell us about where you plan to take it in BFA? So obviously a very very broad question asking about Mythic Plus in Battle for Azeroth. What can you tell us?
So I think we are also, appreciate the sentiment. We are super excited, super happy with how this has turned out in Legion. Plug for the Mythic Dungeon Invitational coming up. Qualifiers or the time trials at the end of the month that will determine the best teams from each region. Really excited to see sort of the conclusion of the Legion season there. Going forward into battle, a couple of small changes. We're not looking to do anything too huge because overall the system has felt like it's worked pretty well. One thing that we're currently looking at doing is actually moving Tyrannical and Fortified down from level 10 affixes all the way to level 2, where that is to say they would replace the base dungeon modifier. Right now, a level 2 keystone is like plus 10% health and damage to everything in the dungeon. Instead, a level 2 keystone would be either Tyrannical or Fortified with no extra bonuses, no extra modifiers. And then the system would build upon that foundation. The key there is there's some interesting texture in whether Trash is harder this week or whether bosses are harder, but it also removes what was a pretty awkward breakpoint when you went from 9 to 10, and you went from pretty comfortably clearing a 9 to getting crushed by a 10. I mean, now these days, with the power curve being where it is, many people are well beyond that, so they don't, it's not as major a concern. But if you think back to fall 2016, when you were trying to do a 10 Tyrannical in the year that you had in late September, early October, that was a giant jump.
You're clearing a 7 very well, and you're like, wait, hold on. We have to slow down so we don't accidentally upgrade to a 10. We want to get the 9 key that we can clear. We don't want the 10. Yeah.
And then that might also make room for another affix or set of affixes that unlock at 10. Something we're experimenting with is what we call Kiss Curse type mechanics, where there's both a bonus and a detriment, and something that you can skillfully play around. We don't have anything we're 100% set on there yet, but we're trying to come up with something that will feel fun and interestingly change your gameplay in that space. Also, in terms of, we want to improve the in-game UI to just show you your progress and to keep better track of what you've done over the course of an entire season or patch. I think we've looked at great community sites like Raider.io and WoW Progress and the work that they've done to store and track that information. The current in-game Mythic UI, Mythic Keystone UI, was really derived from the challenge mode UI back in back in Mists and Warlords, and it doesn't necessarily make as much sense in the current structure. You don't really care necessarily to see that you've done these 6 or 7 dungeons this week. You care more about what have you done this patch? What have you done since it's reset, right? And okay, my best in these dungeons is a 15, 16, 13. Haven't done this one at all, etc. We want to make it easier to track and see that type of information in game.
Cool. Sounds good. Any new affixes or anything along those lines that we're looking at possibly adding?
I think mainly that potential sort of Kiss Curse category that would kick in at 10, but people who've seen data mined blighted stuff, those are experiments in that space. We're not happy with either of those currently, but hoping to find something that works. Suggestions welcome.
I have a suggestion.
Yes, Josh?
Flocking. It's when there's just seagulls spawning constantly throughout the entire dungeon and attacking you.
You're fired.
Okay, fine. I'm just going to go on to the next question. It comes from Tiamat, who says, can you give us some insight into if the crafting system is going to change, and if so, how? I.e. getting rid of how you obtain recipes or multiple ranks, etc. So I know there's lots of changes to the crafting system, which have been data mined, but they look a little bit confusing. Can you clear the air a little bit there?
So I think, as some people in Alpha have seen, what we're doing with crafting in the new expansion isn't drastically different from the structure of, earning recipes from a trainer, from other sources. There are some that have multiple stars that you can skill up to improve their efficiency, all of that stuff. We are getting rid of or changing the way the universal profession skill system works. That started out with 300 points and then 450 and then 600 and so on and so forth. That was always a bit awkward because we want people to be able to catch up and jump into the latest expansion. It led to us minimizing the meaning of skill entirely because, okay, if you need to be 700 skill to do this stuff,
Right.
well, how do you get caught up? Do we really want you to go back and craft useless gear? No. So anyway, we're just breaking it into a bunch of separate buckets where you have, the baseline version of the trade skill, and then there is Outland blacksmithing and Northrend blacksmithing and Cataclysm blacksmithing and so forth that are separate buckets. And so if you've never done any of those, you can't make those items. If you want to go back and make them for transmog or for other purposes, you can go skill up that path accordingly with those materials, but that's a cosmetic choice. From a power perspective, if you're a brand new blacksmith, all you need is baseline blacksmithing and then Kultiran or Zandalari blacksmithing that will let you make all the new stuff from this expansion.
And those aren't like extra things that you have to go and learn, right? It's sort of like, well, maybe for like a short quest chain or something. But
not even that. It's
like
literally on a trainer, right? It's no different from how you would go pay a few gold to learn master blacksmithing or artisan blacksmithing or whatever.
Right. It's not like a specialization like the old school dragon scale leatherworking and so on.
No, again, it's something we try to think a lot about these days as we look at all of our systems is trying to find ways of making them more elegantly scalable. A lot of decisions were made 10 years ago because who expects to seriously be making a game for 15 years? That's insanity. No one back then, when making Burning Crusade leatherworking, I am confident, asked the question or thought so what's this going to look like when we're making our 8th expansion? And so now we're trying to ask those questions and come up with answers.
Yep. Makes a lot. I mean, we were just talking earlier about issues with class design that we've run into because, earlier on, it was just come up with new spells. We can come up with new spells for every class for each expansion, and then 4 expansions later, it's how are we possibly going to come up with new spells for each class? So,
and
it's good questions to be asking.
Indeed. Though, to be clear, it's not that... I think we could come up with new spells.
Sure. Yeah,
it's more that that wouldn't actually be the best thing for the game for us to do so. So just to be clear, it's not a cop-out. We're design is hard. We don't want to do work. It's way easier to just stop. We just want the game to be better.
Exactly. Next question from Lawnroom, who says, will we see any attempt to make crafted gear on par with raid gear, such as raid drop-only mats? That's something that it's almost been like an every other expansion thing, or at least it was for a while, where there was here's the expansion where crafted gear, there's a raid drop mat, and then we're whoa, we don't like that. We're not going to put that in this one. And then the next one's it'd be great raid drop only mats.
I think we want crafted gear to be relevant. I don't have a specific design or plan to announce right now. I think we've tried different approaches. I think, crafted gear that could be upgraded with Obliterum, which was a separate, costly resource, which was at least relevant in the early stages of raiding. That was something that was, that worked out okay. As Josh mentioned, we tried dropped raid mats in the past, going all the way back to, Burning Crusade, notably. Back then, a lot more of it was personal. You were making bind-on pickup items. And there's this awkward, there's some awkward questions around it typically. It's if it's an item for you, then at the end of the day, is this just a regular dropped item that just requires a lot more work to make? Instead of I could just kill this boss and get a helm, but no, actually I got the scales of the dragon and that I combined with this other thing and then spent a bunch of gold and then I made the helm. Or, if it's universal and anyone in the raid can get it, then it doesn't necessarily feel like a true perk for the craftsperson. It is just something that's allocated through a guild bank, and maybe you get it, maybe you don't. It doesn't matter that you're a blacksmith. All of that said, there's obviously a cool fantasy with, killing a dragon and taking the scales from their hide and making a cloak or making something out of it. So I think it's just a matter of trying to fit that fantasy into the reality of the game today. I think it was very different when we were in a world where a boss dropped 2 items or 3 items for 40 players, and it was totally okay to do a bit of extra work to make a 4th or 5th item because you probably weren't going to get one otherwise, versus now when you're looking at Mythic Plus, you're looking at PvP, you're looking at many other avenues of obtaining loot. Things need to feel competitive both in terms of their power but also how hard they are to attain.
Okay. Moving right along, next question comes from Leia Winn, who asked, how will BFA look for alts? Legion was not at all alt-friendly, even with the catch-up mechanics added later. Will this be considered? So I know that I've been on these Q&As a few times saying I actually think Legion is pretty good for alts. If you just try it, you can catch up really, really quickly. Unless you are specifically looking to get into like Mythic rating with your alts, then obviously it's a little bit more difficult. But
and even then, it depends. If you're looking to get into Mythic rating, but you have a guild that's happy to take your alt along on their heroic farm clears where you don't need much of the loot anymore, then it's still pretty quick. I think I would say overall similar to Legion. It's philosophically depends on what you're looking to get out of alts. If what you're looking to get out of alts is varied content, then I think we've made taken a number of steps, including zone choice, more freedom in how you level up, making certain things skippable, like introductory scenarios to the expansion, or being able to unlock world quests or dungeons on an account-wide level rather than having to do them on every character. All those things are done with alt friendliness in mind. If the main thing you're looking for is, I just want a 17th alt that I can use to farm the Horseman mount, that's less of what we're trying to prioritize or facilitate when it comes to alt friendliness. So understandable if, that part of it can feel worse, but sorry. Yeah.
All right.
That's all I got.
Yeah. No, it's also worth mentioning, like, we're kind of talking about Legion now-ish compared to Battle for Azeroth early on, not necessarily Legion at launch, where obviously there were some issues that were addressed.
Exactly. And I think like Battle is going to incorporate a lot of those improvements, those realizations we came to, right? Things like, that content wasn't always unlocked account-wide that I referred to, or things like the artifact knowledge system felt, even with catch-up, brutal for alts, where you just psychologically knew you're like, well, I'm just 3 knowledge behind, and it's going to take me 2 weeks to catch up. The knowledge-like system that we're going to have for Azerite in Battle for Azeroth will work passively in the background, just like knowledge does in Live Legion today. So your alts, again, don't have to go through this onerous catch-up process once they hit max level. But, yeah, so I think, and we'll obviously be looking for, and love to hear feedback about the things that feel most burdensome to do multiple times. It's a fine line, right? Because I think the more we make account wide, the less there is to work towards on your alt. The less, part of the point of playing an alt is maybe you've reached, a plateau on your main character. You're only gearing up in your weekly raid or getting loot out of your mythic loot chest, and you want to get back to a place where you have new goals and lots of things to advance through. And so the more we rush you through that on your alt, the more rapidly you're again getting to that point on your alt where you're like, okay, yeah, I'm also out of stuff here. So it's a balance.
Yep. Makes a lot of sense. We got time for 1 or 2 more questions. We'll take this one from Ann Roca, who said, as a guild leader, I worry the upcoming social features will make guilds less rewarding and coherent. Are any good new things coming for guilds?
Yeah, so the upcoming social features are mainly communities, and that's a sort of a new construct that has improved chat functionality, persistent chat. They can be cross-server. You can be in multiple communities at once to better reflect the different circles of people you might participate in activities with. But everyone, when you log in to 8.0 Battle for Azeroth, pre-patch, you're going to be in one community, and that's going to be your guild. The guilds automatically inherit all of these improvements.
Okay.
So you will have that improved chat functionality, persistent chat, separate channels, voice integration, all of that stuff on a guild level, even if you don't touch any of the other systems. The point of communities is to add something that's a little bit lighter than the guild that you can only be in one of, and it has a bank and feels like a major commitment. When someone says, hey, join my guild, that's not a small thing.
You have to leave your current guild and so on.
Versus, oh yeah, there's this Saturday afternoon pug that runs on a regular basis, and they just formed a community to organize and make calendar events, and you can just casually join that, and maybe sometimes you run some Mythic Plus with folks in it. That's the hope there. But that shouldn't detract from guilds as the server-based social anchor of kind of WoW's true communities.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, I can see the communities actually feeding into guilds in a lot of sense. Like maybe that
Absolutely.
that Saturday pug that you were just describing is run by maybe you as a guild want to run a Saturday pug, so you make a community for that. And then as people, you sort of get to know them through being in that community. You say, hey, actually, why don't you join our guild? It's a great place, and you've got that sort of inlet there at that situation.
Exactly.
So I can see a lot of situations where it can actually really help. Let's go ahead and take one more question here from Soladin, who said, fans fairly criticize the splitting of Legion content among 13 classes and 36 specs. What can we expect with the leveling experience being entirely unique between both factions? I think basically, starting with basic math here, a split of 1 into 12 is different than a split of 1 into 2. So there's a fairly substantial difference.
Yeah, we have
there.
1/6 as much content in Battle for Azeroth.
That's not what I meant.
Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I meant.
Okay. Sorry. But yes. So obviously, less division there. I mean, this isn't an entirely unprecedented concept, right? If you think back to many past expansions, Horde leveled in Frostfire and Alliance leveled in Shadowmoon Valley back in Warlords, or going farther back, there were plenty of very different quest lines. You were going through Alliance bases versus Horde bases and doing different things as you leveled through Wrath of the Lich King or what have you. There's still neutral quest lines, neutral areas that both sides will do, both sides will experience. But I think one of the things that's really cool about the Battle for Azeroth leveling structure is, in a sense, when you hit max level, you're not just going to have, you have, in Legion you had this one new zone of Suramar, but in Battle for Azeroth, the entire world effectively doubles in size. You'll go from having leveled through Zandalar to now having 3 all-new Kultiran zones where you'll be advancing the storytelling through your war campaign, doing world quests, exploring, doing dungeons and all that stuff there. That the rest of our content is also mirrored in that way. Like dungeon-wise, Alliance level up dungeons will be some of the Horde max level dungeons, and vice versa.
Okay.
There's also
Cool.
a couple of dungeons that are universally max level for everybody, but there's a lot of new content as a result of this that's waiting for everyone when they get there. And if you're someone who likes playing both factions, of course, there's going to be 2 unique stories that you can play through to really see both sides of the conflict in Battle for Azeroth.
Awesome. Sounds really good. Well, thank you so much for coming on here, answering these questions.
Absolute pleasure as always.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in and sending in these questions. Really, really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you guys' feedback on the Battle for Azeroth Alpha as we're continuing to ramp that up. Obviously, a lot of you've noticed we've been inviting a lot more people lately, and that's I would imagine will continue.
That will continue. Yes,
yep.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's going to go ahead and wrap us up. Thanks again so much for being here.
Thank you.
We'll see you guys next time.
Take care.